Welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, which is a partnership between War on the Rocks and the University of Texas at Austin. My name is Rick Landgraf, managing editor of TNSR. American leaders and scholars have long feared the prospect that hostile foreign powers could subvert democracy by spreading false, misleading, and inflammatory information by using various media. Drawing on both historical experience and empirical literature, Gavin Wilde argues that such fears may be both misplaced and misguided. The relationship between people's attitudes and their media consumption remains murky at best, despite technological advances promising to decode or manipulate it. This limitation extends to foreign foes as well. Policymakers therefore risk becoming pessimistic toward the public and distracted from the domestic, real-world drivers of their confidence in democratic institutions. Policy interventions may also prove detrimental to democratic values like free expression and to the norms that the United States aims to foster in the information environment. In this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, I speak with Gavin Wilde, author of From Panic to Policy: The Limits of Foreign Propaganda and the Foundations of an Effective Response, which appears in the spring issue of the Texas National Security Review. I hope you enjoy the show. Gavin, welcome to the show.
Pleasure to be here.
Gavin, I want to start off first with what motivated you to write this piece, and based on your background, what prompted you to kind of get into this field?
This paper is something of a project that I undertook to try and explain my concerns about information warfare, or rather perhaps how we in the U.S. community have come to perceive of information warfare. I wanted to explain it to myself. I knew that I had some thoughts about where we've come since 2016, but I didn't know quite how to articulate them. I knew that I had some concerns about the way we conceptualize the problem, but had trouble kind of putting a name to these things and wanted to really come at it from a historical perspective, from a social science perspective, to try to explain these concerns and the concerns, I think, of some of my peers and colleagues. And so this paper is really the outcome of that exploration. And the evolution of my thinking, certainly since 2016, has kind of, I would almost call it a bit of a deconversion process. If there was a lot of deep concern in 2016 about these information warfare tactics, certainly by Russia, but by, I think, U.S. adversaries writ large, if there was concern back then that we didn't quite have a grasp on how they operated, I think that pendulum has now swung to where this paper certainly touches on the theme of concern that we've almost adopted the worldview, or adopted the sense of how information works that Moscow and others use, that we've adopted that ourselves. And I think there's a few aspects of that which are problematic. And so I kind of approached this paper, and as the outcome, I would offer that there's maybe two logics that I interrogate here. Number one, the logic of kind of propaganda and the threat that it poses to faith in democracy, faith in institutions. And then number two, the kind of methodology of how we study propaganda and the logic that entails, and the logic that technological advances, and certainly those that in more recent history have lent us a deluge of quantifiable data to talk about how we study propaganda. And so those two logics are really the ones that I interrogate, I think, most in this paper, and kind of offer a little bit of, my perspective on how and why we ought to right size those logics, or perhaps modulate how much emphasis we put on different aspects of those logics.
And how should we study propaganda? There's various terms out there: propaganda, information warfare, misinformation, disinformation. You teach these to students at SICE. What are the best kind of ways to study this problem?
So I think certainly from a military and an intelligence perspective, in Moscow or DC alike, we've long ago cooked up models of the information environment for very circumscribed kind of environments or circumstances. But too often, I think we conflate the necessary coherence of those models for an accurate representation of the way humans and societies function. So I think the grander your aspirations, the more this turns into a problem. For instance, if you're in the military, you certainly need plans to make, the opposing side think you're going to zig when you actually intend to zag. And those kinds of things are necessary in military planning. However, when you get to the kind of societal level, I think the coherence of these models kind of as a representation for the way humans and societies function beyond those covert operational contexts are appealing because they kind of flatten very complex situations full of contingencies and subjectivity and into simplified two-dimensional universes of direct cause and effect where the sheer force of will and superior orchestration might prevail. But ironically, those are the same kinds of characteristics most people use to describe propaganda itself. So this kind of prepackaged sense of community, a common mission or purpose, a set of rationalizations for our behaviors. And so I think it's problematic to try to take the tradecraft and the methodology that are necessary in those very concrete military and covert intelligence arenas that are more tactical, I would say, and try to extrapolate therefrom and overlay it onto broad scale societal level deception or subversion. Again, I understand the appeal of that, but I think it's probably leads us down some dark alleys.
And in your view, you talk about in the paper that the debate whether or not this is effective by foreign adversaries is unsettled. It's an unsettled debate, within the scholarly and public realms. And the fact that there is this debate means that it's really no easier for foreign foes to kind of make the same determination. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think the word that I probably centered on that kind of explains a lot of my own misgivings that I've come to have about the way we think about propaganda or information warfare is positivism. And that's a word you see thrown around certainly in legal circles and in the sciences. But positivism in this context, I mean the assumption that there must be some universal laws and mechanics that govern the way human beings and media interact to form beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors, as if we're talking about something akin to physics or chemistry, and that there's some kind of grand formula for persuasion or control, and we are in a race with our adversaries to find it and leverage it. And I think this kind of thinking, this kind of positivism, if you will, certainly infused the way Moscow has historically thought about information. But unlike the natural sciences, communication and cognition and sociality are very, very complex, meaning the particles or the matter, so to speak, that we're studying are not inert and mechanical, but they have agency, a sense of purpose, subjective interpretation. So as we think about how humans interact with narratives, I think there's a risk to treating the humans in that equation as if they were themselves particles without agency or discernment. And where I worry we've landed now in the kind of popular discourse around disinformation in particular is that we've now tend to treat the narratives and the propaganda as if they themselves have the agency and the free will, and that the humans that we're talking about are the inert, agency-less particles in this equation. And I think a point that I allude to in the paper is that technological advances over the past 50 to 70 years have only lent us more impetus to continue leaning into that positivism, because certainly in the media environment, we've only been given more and more kind of granular sets of data through which to try to examine how humans and media interact. And so we've not been able to break free of that kind of positivistic approach to communication and media.
This piece came out it was published couple of weeks ago online, and it's in the spring issue of TNSR. But it's also timely. We've got the U.S. election, presidential election coming up in November. On a broader scale, essentially half the world's population is conducting some sort of an election throughout 2024. So it's a timely piece because it's an important topic, especially with regard to how people are persuaded or not with regards to online behavior. What kind of reaction has this piece received so far?
So I've heard from a lot of folks within government, certainly folks in the media, who have to deal with editors that certainly like a juicy story about disinfo, from some folks in civil society who were appreciative of this and some of the companion pieces that put out subsequently, because I think, again, for them, they probably struggled with this same set of very complex instincts about the way we talk about propaganda or foreign malign influence that sometimes feel, even to well-motivated and well-meaning analysts, somewhat oversimplistic or a little bit problematic. I think the thing that we're currently dealing with, certainly as the election season draws nearer, is that there's a set of kind of built-in incentive structures that have come to kind of solidify post-2016, where everyone is now incentivized to expose and attempt these kinds of operations. And all of the incentives to actually critically interrogate whether or not they actually had a real world impact are kind of swept to the side. So in terms of, like, if you're an entrepreneurial troll farm, let's say, in an adversarial country, you have some degree of incentive to attempt an operation to be identified and exposed by civil society or the media, who then rush to publicize their findings, or for government agencies to, whether it's levy sanctions or issue some kind of statement. So all of that attention enables you, if you're in that adversarial country, to then turn around and go to potential patrons in government or the security services to say, hey, look, what we're doing is having a splash. Can you please fund us or give us political cover? And round and round and round that cycle goes. And breaking that cycle of kind of hype and fear and uncertainty and doubt is very difficult. There's really no incentive for anyone to kind of to do so. And so a lot of the work I've done in the last few months on this is to try to give folks some ammunition as to why that hype cycle might be counterproductive.
As far as adversary techniques, a lot has been said and talked about. Russian interference in the 2016 election, 2020 election. What do you see are differences or similarities between Russian attempts and some other adversarial states?
So I'm certainly no expert on, Chinese or Iranian or North Korean kind of influence operations, but I think the Russian attempts certainly, to my mind, lean into this idea of any exposure and any publicity is worthwhile, and that very sense of fear and uncertainty and doubt, whether or not we convince anyone of a narrative or not, that sense of untruth, that there's no truth to be found and that there's no such thing as kind of an objective reality, like the exposure in and of itself is worthwhile. And I think that's a uniquely Russian regime way of thinking about the power of information or propaganda.
Is this sort of the idea that any publicity is good publicity?
Very much so. Very much so. So I think there's not only a disincentive to be covert and discreet, but almost the opposite. There's every incentive to be as cartoonish and outlandish and loud and disruptive as possible, because that gets a lot of attention, and certainly in the West, and certainly among the U.S., and certainly in the context of elections. And so I think there's a case to be made that some more strategic ignoring, as I would call it, of a lot of these attempts is probably in order by certainly the national security bureaucracy, but also, civil society and others in the media of before we expose these and make a big splashy show about calling these out, whether we think that these have had any discernible real world impact, and kind of show our math if we think that's the case. And if not, what's the real public service we think we're doing? And if it's just inviting more fear and uncertainty and doubt, that might also be playing right into the objectives of the adversary, or actually being counterproductive in terms of protecting democracy, so to speak.
As researchers or policymakers, analysts, how can we measure impact of disinformation or foreign interference? It's really a hard thing to do. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think at least from what I came away with in this paper is I personally don't know from an empiric perspective whether measuring impact ought to be the objective in the first instance. I'm no social scientist, but I'm also very skeptical that there's an endpoint there, that actually impact is measurable in any meaningful way at present. And I think the search to measure it, certainly using a lot of data from social media, is itself probably counterproductive. I think social media has offered us a bit of a unhelpful petri dish for researchers to examine users and narratives as kind of these prepackaged particles, as I said, where the job of understanding the pre-existing biases and real-world life experiences and preferences has either already been completed by the platforms or is easy to brush aside entirely. And so this casts us in the research or civil society or government positions as the ultimate kind of proponents or arbiters of what ought to count as, truthful, accurate, and discernible knowledge, as if we are ourselves neutral bystanders and referees rather than active participants in crafting the very environment that we're studying. And so this approach tends to treat words and images, likes, shares, clicks, as having concrete or objective or self-evident meanings, or to treat truth and accuracy as somehow the readily available compass that people use to navigate the world, or the baseline from which groups of humans begin. But none of those are really the case in kind of the humanities and the social sciences.
And your piece focuses on government responses to foreign propaganda. In your view, should government be responsible for this, or what role does the private sector have in policing this sort of activity?
I worry that the more the government leans into this and kind of exerts top-down pressure on public discourse, that entails more autocratic instincts than it does democratic instincts, and that's unfortunately a slippery slope. But I've certainly come to the point of view that kind of information warfare, as it's currently kind of described in national security circles, has autocratic instincts at its core. And so again, outside of those very circumspect military or intelligence contexts, I worry that, applying that certainly to broad swaths of societies in a foreign policy context, but certainly from a domestic one, I think it's probably counterproductive. I'm a fan of civil society initiatives to try to center facts and truth in public discourse through awareness campaigns or media literacy or fact-checking. However, I think the more we intermingle those efforts with, much less base them on, the authority of the state, those instincts are tough to distinguish from those that kind of guide autocracies. This idea that you kind of infantilize your citizens and approach them as hapless dupes, or start to kind of conspiracize about orchestrated narratives from abroad, and you kind of gaslight yourself into thinking that every narrative must be the product of some kind of orchestration. The deeper you go down that pathway, that sounds a lot more like Moscow than it does a flourishing democracy. A democracy is kind of the optimism in the idea that our state can not only tolerate, but withstand a high degree of dissent and misconception, or even, dare I say, political skullduggery, and somehow still kind of the experiment can survive and move forward. I think one of the other things that I touch on in the paper that I'm really concerned about is that I spoke of positivism before. I think another byproduct of this approach, certainly when it comes to governments and national security bureaucracies, is kind of cultivating this pessimism towards society or towards your citizenry. So when your leaders and your political decision makers start to adopt that degree of pessimism, I don't know that you can service your fear of foreign subversion and your faith and optimism in the democratic experiment at the same time. One of those is going to come at the expense of the other. So in terms of policy prescriptions, I think leaning deeper into that democratic resilience and kind of bolstering trust in institutions, that work is inherently kind of domestic. That's rooted in our domestic lived experience. That's not technocratic. That's not something that we can get the social media platforms to do for us. That's the hard work of political leaders and elites here at home. And while that's a heavy lift, it's certainly a heavy lift to hope that we can somehow claw our way towards a healthier political discourse. I don't think that's any heavier of a lift or any more magical thinking than the idea of kind of this foreign mass mind control using technology that I worry we've kind of, that narrative is kind of one that's too easy. That's a bit of an easy button for our decision makers to latch onto as kind of the cure for eroding faith in democracy.
As far as any points that you want to elaborate on, or parts of the piece or an earlier version that didn't make it into the final version, hit the cutting room floor, now's your chance to kind of elaborate on some of the other points of the piece. So
I think some of the stuff that I needed to cut for the sake of brevity, if you can call it that, for an academic paper, but if I had another kind of chapter length to dive into it, it certainly would have been this idea of complexity science and to try to guide us away from that technocentrism or the kind of over focus on social media as the thing that we're studying to try to understand these phenomena of human suasion or of belief formation. One of the anecdotes that I really enjoyed comes from, 1960, where Edward Lorenz was this kind of meteorologist that was the first to really use, early computers to try to model weather patterns. And it was kind of one of the birthplace of complexity science or chaos theory, if you will, that the more he moved the decimal points in his models to the right, aka the more granular his measurements became, the more wildly unpredictable the model became. So I think that's instructive because I think there's this tendency, again, when we think about media, studying media and communication, we tend to think that the more data points we can collect, the more insights we can glean, and the closer we might get to this idea of these underlying laws of communication. But in fact, sometimes the opposite is the case. The more data we collect and the more variety we introduce into these systems and the more confounding variables we introduce into them, and the less predictable they become. And so I think, for folks out there who are thinking, well, look, we just need more data on how humans and media interact, I would argue, well, maybe, but also maybe that itself would open up far more rabbit holes than you could ever chase down, and might not lead you any closer to understanding how and why people think or believe or behave the way they do based on their interaction with media in particular.
Yeah, as far as what's concerning you moving forward, we've got the U.S. presidential election in a few months' time. Should folks be worried about the impact of foreign interference, or how do you see this playing out?
I think folks, particularly on the Hill and in D.C., ought to be worried about foreign interference and influence, but far more in a real-world perspective than in media and certainly in social media. In the latter, there's just simply not very much evidence to show that the impacts are anything beyond marginal. Now, in the real world, however, we've got certainly a number of instances and test cases to demonstrate that foreign money and lack of transparency in lobbying and foreign influence in terms of folks tied to the intelligence and security agencies are interacting with political campaigns, et cetera. Like, those are really very concrete use cases, ones for which there are existing laws that have nothing to do with public discourse, for which, the national security bureaucracy is simply better suited to try and police this space and put some hard guardrails around it. But those are often those require an awful lot of political will. Those are less sexy in terms of how much media coverage they can get. And I think sometimes they often our conversation about foreign influence through social media is a welcome distraction for our policymakers, when so much of the work that needs to be done policing foreign subversion in our political space requires more of them than of the platforms or of the citizens or of the users. That it's going to require them to make some hard choices about prosecutions, about their own behaviors, the way they communicate, their own role in creating a healthy political discourse. So I do think, yes, that we need to be worried about foreign interference, simply not really in the way that takes up most of the oxygen to date, which has been in how foreign actors may express an opinion or may try to foster an opinion in public discourse, for which our national security bureaucracy, both by law and by design, don't have much of an ability to interject themselves, nor in a free and flourishing democracy would you necessarily want them to.
We're going to have to leave it there for today. Thanks for being on the show, and thanks for listening to Horns of Dilemma.
Pleasure to be with you. Thanks for having me.